Okay. So we started this idea yesterday with the cost of, or not yesterday, but Tuesday with the A-Day students. And we got through about a third of these notes. So I've got some of them already written down, but I'm going to go through the first part with you guys, and then we will continue on with the new stuff. Okay? So this video is online, the first couple ideas here. So as I go through them fairly quickly, just make sure you can go back and look at the other view to review it. Okay? So what we're going to do is talk about basically what productivity is. So if you'll notice, there's about 8 or 9 questions there that we're going to try to answer today that deals with production of things, okay, and how the cost of that affects certain things. Okay? So the first question that we have to answer for this SOL is, what is productivity? Okay? Your book or your notes definition says that productivity refers to outputs per worker. Okay? It is measured by dividing output, which is goods and services, by the number of inputs used to produce the output. Now that sounds really confusing. Okay? So let's just make this as simple as possible. I would write down the word productivity in my notes. Okay? Productivity. Now it's asking you, what does it mean? I would simply put down that is output per worker. How much is this individual getting done with this individual, this individual, this individual? You guys with me? So it's outputs per worker. And then there's a simple formula to figure that out. Okay, and I'm going to show it to you in my notes right here. That way it's not confusing to you. Okay? In my notes, I simply put down that to find productivity, you take outputs, which is goods and services, okay? Which is goods and services, and you divide that by the number of inputs. Outputs, which are goods and services, divided by the number of inputs. So basically, how much are we putting into something to produce it? That's the concept that we're getting at here. All right? So that is how we find productivity. Now, there have been people in history that have figured out easier ways to make things in a more efficient, faster way. Do any of you know someone in history that created things in a more efficient way? He's got a vehicle named after him. Henry Ford. What did he create that made things more efficient and increased production? He created the assembly line. So, in your opinion, if I were to tell, okay, you four, I need you guys to make 5,000 cookies by the end of the day. If I were to tell you that, right? Well, then Jace goes out and starts making his own. You go out and start making your own, doing it y'all's way. Alexis goes and does it her way. Alejandra goes and does it her way. At the end of the day, are we going to have 5,000? I mean, maybe, right? But you guys are going to work really, really hard to make as many cookies as you possibly can, right? Now, to increase that production, what if I said, all right, Jace, all you have to do today is mix all the ingredients together for the cookies? Could you handle that? Gave you the measurements. This is how much of this you need, this is how much of that you need. Mix it all together.
Probably.
Okay? Once you mix it together, split it into fourths. You take a quarter of it, Casey a quarter of it, Lex a quarter of it, Alejandra a quarter of it, right? Casey, once you get the quarter of it, all I want you to do is cut them out. So all you're doing all day is cutting them out. Cookies, you think you can do that? Alejandra, all you got to do is preheat every oven we got. Alexis, all you got to do is put them in the oven. Jace, you take them out when they're done. We just created a what? Assembly line. And by that point, we could probably produce more, right? So, what is an increase in productivity? And this is the example that we just went over. It says, when Henry Ford introduced the assembly line, cars could be built with many fewer man hours. That's the key here, okay? If I want to increase productivity, I have to pay someone to make all these goods and services, right? Well, if I can make them more efficient, they don't have to work as much, meaning I'll save money, correct? So an increase in productivity is by decreasing certain aspects of the production. Because less was spent on labor, the cost of production went down, the price of cars went down, and more cars were sold. That's the whole concept, right? We want to sell more, hopefully sell more than we can make and keep it going, right? So an increase in productivity occurs when the same output can be produced with fewer resources. And that's the part I need you to put down, okay? An increase in production occurs when the same output can be produced with fewer resources. And you can shorten that any way you want to, but I have it highlighted there. That's the part that's important, okay? How can we increase production by reducing something else, preferably cost? Okay, so we can increase it How can we increase it? It's simple. One of the easiest things is assembly line. Create efficiency. You're kind of getting an assembly line when it comes to your education, if you think about it. You come in here for an hour and a half and listen to me talk about economics and personal finance, right? Then you meander on down the hall to English or history or building trades or whatever it is you do, right? And they drill you for an hour and a half, and then you go do something else. So education is very similar. We're trying to be more productive. It would be really hard for me to try to teach you guys everything you need to know on a daily basis, right? Like, I feel for elementary school teachers. That's a tough job because they go from reading to math to writing. You know, that would be very difficult to do, but they do it, okay? So how do you increase productivity? By simply getting the same output by using less resources. So far, so simple. Just making sense? I hope. Beside of that, write down the example as an assembly line. Just in parentheses beside of that, write down the assembly line. All right. Now this is where we got to on Tuesday with A-Day students. The question is asking you what is gross domestic product. I actually asked you guys that question on your test, if you remember, right? But I gave you the answer to it because we hadn't went over it yet. Y'all remember I said this number, just put down I lost my train of thought, I'm sorry. I said just write down GDP for this one. Remember I didn't really explain it. So that's what we're going to do today. So in your notes, write down gross domestic product, and in parentheses beside of that, put down GDP. GDP. You will hear me refer to gross domestic product as GDP all the time. Okay? Now, what is it? The long definition is that is the basic measure of a nation's economic output and income. So basically, we take in how much stuff we produce, on a yearly basis, and then how much money we created from it. Y'all got me? So, take a wild guess at this because I don't figure many of you would know the answer. How much do you think America's GDP was in this last couple of years?
How much they made?
How much we produced in total value, yeah.
Well, what are we producing?
It's literally everything.
Well,
Anything we produce. Think about it, throw a number.
500, I don't know.
Now think about this. Over a yearly basis in the entire United States,
Oh,
every state, every business, everything we do,
a few million.
what do you think the gross domestic product in the U.S. would be, money-wise?
Billion.
Now, just to give you an idea of how the COVID has affected things, in 2018, which was 2 years ago, Our GDP was $20 trillion. That's a ton of money. Literally, like tons of money. Okay? Now, just to give you a perspective on what the virus did, right now in 2020, we're in September, the GDP has decreased by 34%. So that number has went down by 34%. Now, that sounds like a tremendous amount of money, right? 34%, which is roughly 19.41 trillion, or excuse me, 2.15 trillion, or we lost about 20 trillion in one quarter. So we're losing. We lost a lot of money due to that virus.
Just because people are.
Nobody was working.
People,
They shut down the economy, shut down businesses forever. So, GDP is the basic measure of a nation's economic output and income. That's what I would like for you to put down. It's the next part. It is the total market value measured in dollars of all final goods and services produced. So, as far as the definition goes for GDP, put down it's the market value in dollars. Market value in dollars for all final goods and services produced. Okay? For all goods and services. Now, how long of a period do they judge this on? Every how long? A couple months, 6 months, what?
year.
Every year. You need to jot that down. It's the total market value in dollars of all goods and services produced in 1 year. Okay? So far, so simple. Does that make sense? Yes, Mr. Bertram, that makes complete sense. All right. The next part of this is new for everybody, so everybody online is going to have to pay attention to what we're doing next. We just answered what is gross domestic product. We're going to skip ahead a little bit and talk about what is gross domestic product per capita. So what we're doing here is we're going to take the total amount of goods and services that we produce, and we're going to see how it's used for the standard of living. Okay? Now this gets a little funny, but basically, guys, it's the amount that we share from our GDP. Okay? If you look at the definition for GDP per capita, it says it is the measure most often used to measure a standard of living. Well, what's a standard of living? It's how people survive in nations. You guys know as well as I do, in the U.S., we have it a little bit better than most other countries, right? As far from an individual standpoint, our standard of living is a lot higher than other places. Y'all with me on that? So, it says real GDP per capita is calculated by dividing a nation's real GDP by its population. So we would take that $22 trillion that I was talking about in 2018, and we would divide it by the 8 trillion or so, or 8 billion or so people that live in the U.S. And whatever that number may be, that is the average of what people share in what we make. Does that make sense? So, beside of GDP per capita, write this down. GDP per capita. Put down first that it measures our standard of living, or a country's standard of living. Now, obviously, guys, the higher this number is, the better off living we have, right? People make more money, produce more things of that nature. It says it is what each person's share would be if the total output of a country was divided equally among its citizens. So we need to know the formula for this, okay? So, put down that we're going to divide GDP, just write down GDP under this, divided by the population. Okay, so let's try to give you an example of that. I don't know if my phone will do 22 trillion, but we'll find out, okay? Do you know how many zeros is in a trillion?
No.
That's a billion.
Oh.
I'm gonna get my phone to go up to 220 million. So if you divide that, if you divide 22 trillion by 8 billion, whatever that number is, that's the average share if we split it up that way. Now guys, use common sense. Is everybody's equal? No. My piece of the pie may be a lot smaller than Donald Trump's. See what I'm getting at? So it's GDP divided by population. But here's the sticking point, and here's the one I want you to know. GDP per capita. Put down, it is what each person's share would be if we divided things equally. It's what each person's share would be. If we divided it equally. Okay. Obviously, it's not divided equally, but it just gives a roundabout average of things. Okay. It measures our standard of living. Obviously, countries want this to be high, because if it's high, does it attract more people and more business and more money into your country if your per capita GDP is high? Yes. Okay. So that's per capita. Okay. Anybody got any questions between what GDP is and then GDP per capita is? GDP is the amount of stuff we produce on a yearly basis, all of it. GDP per capita is what we produce divided by the population to get an average of what people, the standard of living would be. When you see per capita, think standard of living. Does everybody understand that? Okay. All right. Moving on. Now, since we talked a little bit about the standard of living, we can kind of add on to this. It says, how does economic growth affect a nation's standard of living? Well, use common sense, guys. If our and what I mean by economic growth is there's more money flowing through the economy. We'll be talking about circular flow next week, and that's everything that moves through an economy. But if our GDP per capita goes up, what happens to the standard of living? Does it increase or decrease? It increases. That means there's more stuff to do, more stuff flowing through the economy, more money, right? If our GDP per capita goes down, what happens to our standard of living? It also goes down. Use common sense right now. We're going through a global pandemic. It's hit the United States hard, right? People haven't worked for a long time. At the end of this year, when they measure our GDP, is it going to be high or low?
Oh.
It's going to be lower, just simply because people can't produce as much as we have in the past because we've not had the ability or been able to, right? So what's the standard of living in the United States going to do? It's going to drop down. Y'all see that? So, how does economic growth affect the nation's standard of living? Simple. An increase in GDP over time indicates economic growth, which means the nation is producing more goods and services than the year before. A decrease indicates an economic contraction. So, same thing under GDP per capita. We're going to write two little things down off this slide. Put down increase in GDP. Increase in GDP. And again, what does GDP stand for? Gross what? Domestic product, right? If that goes up, what happens to the economic growth? Is it going up or down? It's going up. So are we producing more or less goods and services?
More.
More. So put down increase in GDP equals more goods and services. Is everybody with me on that? An increase in GDP equals more goods and services. Now, let's do it on the flip side. Let's say there's a decrease in GDP. Well, if we have a decrease in it, what's happened to our economy? Is it growing or contracting? You guys know what a contraction is, right? Don't tell me it's when someone's pregnant. But a contraction is when everything tenses up, gets tight, right? It's hard. So, decrease in GDP, put down equals an economic contraction. Means things slow down. Everything gets tighter, okay? There's not as much money flowing.
Equals what?
Contraction, economic contraction. I have it on the board. It's the last one there. Oops. All right, is everybody, so far so good? Everybody know the difference between GDP and GDP per capita? All right. Next question that we need to answer. Let me get back up here to our list of questions. So we've talked about increase in productivity. We've talked about cost of production. We've talked about economic growth. We've talked about GDP, and we've talked about GDP per capita. We've talked about standard of living, right? And then we got to talk about how the economic growth affects our standard of living, which I think you guys can probably figure out, okay? Now, how does economic growth affect a nation's standard of living? So, make this a subtitle. Economic growth affecting standard of living. Okay, economic growth affecting standard of living. Guys, this should be common sense right here. If our economy is growing, does that mean there's more or less money in it?
More.
There's more money in it. If there's more money in it, what can businesses do with that money?
Speaking on more stuff.
What stuff? You be specific. What type of stuff would they spend it
What
on?
kind of business it is.
No.
Better equipment.
Well, you could get better equipment, or you could hire new what? Workers to create more production. Correct? So it's always a good thing if productivity is up. If we are increasing productivity, and that's how I want you to write it down. Put down increase in production, and then put an equal sign. An increase in production means that labor improves. Means we can have more of it, right? And if labor improves, if more people are working, then what's production going to be up or down? Exactly. Increase in production. Labor improves, the economy grows. All right. What happens to the GDP if there's more labor? Does it go up or down? Remember, what does GDP measure? All final goods and services, right?
Yeah.
So if there's more people working, are we going to have more or less GDP? More. So GDP increases. Y'all see why, right? This makes sense? So then what would happen to our standard of living? If we increase production, which increases labor, increases gross domestic product, then at the end of the year, when we divide the gross domestic product by the population, that number is going to be higher, right? So what happened to the standard of living? Did it increase or decrease? It increased. So our standard of living increases. Our standard of living increases. Okay? So, any type of increase in production is good for everybody. You understand it? It's good for the business, it's good for the workers, it's good for consumers. Okay? It means more money is being used. Now let's flip this. We don't have to write this down, but if we were to decrease production, we'd have less workers, right? That means the GDP would decrease, and then obviously our standard of living would do what? Go down, right? We ain't no point in writing that again, okay? So, it says that economic growth has been the vehicle for alleviating poverty and raising the standard of living. So the idea is the more production we create, the less poverty we would have. You guys with me? Obviously, we haven't created enough to get rid of all poverty, but the idea is to do that, okay? Now, that's all of SOL2F. It deals with production. Is everybody good there? Does that make sense? All right, good deal.